And today we're talking OWIB as a convening of LBT plus women exists in a lineage of queer community that has often been won at enormous cost. And I'm hoping that this session with our truly phenomenal panelists, who I'll talk about in just a second, will illuminate some of that history and guide us to push for what's most needed next on behalf of queer women. This is obviously not something we could ever fully cover in 40 minutes, but I've started a brief resource document that can be found right here. I'm going to drop the link into the chat. And I also have someone keeping an eye on it to update it through the panel. And I will add that our panelists have very graciously agreed to let me get their full bios so we can dig right into this, enormous topic. But just so you know, I'm not messing around when I say I feel very, very lucky to be publicly interrogating them. Imani Rupert Gordon is the executive director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Dr. Eloise Epstein is a partner at Carney, where she leads the firm's procurement practice. And Sunu Chandy is the legal director at the National Women's Law Center, as well as being a poet and activist. And we may get a touch of her poetry today. My first question does help you get to know these folks a little bit, though. And I'm curious for all three of you, who opened the door for you to be your full self at work and how? Sunu, you want to kick us off?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having us. This is really wonderful to connect with so many students and people who will absolutely be those movers and shakers in our world and have so much really power in our society to help all of us do the right thing on a range of social justice issues. So who opened the door? I guess I'm thinking about women of color poets and writers. Audre Lorde and Gloria Anzaldúa. I mean, when I was in college, those were the voices that created space for me to feel like I could exist in our world and be myself. And in addition to that, people like Urvashi Vad, who was leading up the task force when I was in college. And when I was in college, and I still remember when a friend said that a South Asian woman was leading up this like gay organization. I was like, just stop it right now. That cannot be true. I do not believe you. And it just changed my life, right? And so to fast forward, and now I'm like on panels with her, like, hi, it's pretty intense because like these are people who really were out when it felt like an even more scary time to be out, and really opened up doors. So those are just, I could name 100 people, but those are some of the ones that come to mind.
Dr. Epstein, how about you?
Well, I'm going to build on the same theme. I'm trans, so obviously the two that come to mind are Janet Mock and Laverne Cox, and seeing these very public representations that were very positive, if not difficult for them to be charting new territory. And I've always looked to them, especially Janet. I'm from Oakland, or at least I live in Oakland and for many decades now. And she's from there. And so seeing them publicly and really own their truth really opened a door to me to understand that I don't have to hide and I can be in the world myself. So absolutely those two without a doubt.
And I will say the same thing. I don't know how you answer this question without saying Audre Lorde and looking at intersections of identity, which is a really important part of me. And also, I don't know how to do this without saying Janet Mock as well. I think she's a really important part of our community. She's kind and so giving with her time. And, for many of us thinking about our LGBTQ identities, we don't talk about these things in a vacuum. My identity as a queer person, I don't, when I'm talking to you as a queer person, I didn't stop being Black when that happened. And so talking about intersections of identity, I only know how to talk about being queer and also being Black and also being a woman. And that's what I have to do. Though I will say that something that stood out to me was that when I first came out, I remember someone asked me if I would consider being openly queer. And she did that because she said that, young Black girls don't see themselves represented in people like you. And that was something that really stood out to me because I was younger at the time and I didn't really think about people looking at me that way at all. But I did know that when that I didn't see myself represented, that there were different rooms when I would have conversations about queerness, that it wasn't necessarily in places that also centered racial justice. And then when I was in places that honored my Blackness and looking to center racial justice, that it didn't always center my queer identity that same way. And so that was something that was really, really important to me and something that I took for heart. And now you can't Google me without knowing that I'm queer.
We all aspire to such heights. I would love to hear a little bit. I mean, we're grounding this in history, and so I would like to understand where we're at now with legal protections for LGBT plus women, and what were the inflection points that got us here? And furthermore, where are the gaps? And I'm struck particularly in reflecting on your answer, Imani, that one of our great legal minds, Kimberly Crenshaw, who came up with intersectionality, speaks to the very fact of her Blackness and her womanhood disqualifying her from protections under both. Like, that's the meaning of intersectionality, rather than it being sort of an additive thing, that the cross section of those two identities excludes her from protection, because you can argue that the other one's the problem. So can you shed some light for us?
Sure, I'm glad you said that. And honestly, because we're in this room, because you mentioned intersectionality, and because we get it wrong so much, I just want to add to something there too. And that is that when we're talking about intersections of identities, it's not just that it's hard when you have multiple underrepresented identities, though it is hard. That's not actually the problem. It's the systems that are in place that make us invisible or fall through the cracks because of the intersections of our identities. And so the important part there are the systems in place, the structures in place. And that gets to your question about protections. And I think that that's something really important. Marriage equality is a big one for our community, and really happy to see that. But it's kind of odd that we think about like having marriage equality, but we don't have any federal protections. And something that folks say all the time is that you can go and get married on Saturday. On Sunday, you can lose your housing in some places. Your new spouse moves in with you, and Monday you can lose your job because you put a picture of your new spouse in your on your wedding day. And so we don't have a lot of protections there. And so, one of the things that the two things that come up most recently is the recent Bostock decision. I'm going to let Sunu talk about that because she's a lawyer, and lawyers love to break this kind of stuff down. But also something that we're spending a lot of time in right now is thinking about the Equality Act. And this would be providing federal legislation to protect LGBTQ people for the very first time in this country. And that's important because we are often under I'm sorry, it's so loud out here, there's motorcycles. We are often under the impression that we have protections as LGBTQ people. We're talking to you as openly queer and trans people, and we're doing this in our work a lot of times. But we have to recognize that some of us have these protections because we live in states that have very broad protections. I'm in California. I'm also in Oakland as well. We have very broad protections in California, but this is not the case everywhere. And so how can we have these? We need protections for all LGBTQ people so that we can be our full authentic selves. And that's something that that we just don't have right now. And many people think that that we do. The Equality Act would add some other sort of protections for folks from underrepresented identities by expanding on the Civil Rights Act, which is also really important. But right now, there's 29 states that don't have laws that will protect LGBTQ people from discrimination. And that's something that's obviously unacceptable. It's not safe for people in our community. And we really want to do this, and we want to do it now. We've been trying to do this since, I think every year we've tried to pass federal legislation since I want to say it's 1973. I want to say every single year that we've tried to do it and haven't done it yet. And honestly, we need to get it done. We don't want to get in a situation like we see with other like amendments that should have been passed years ago, and we're still trying to get these things done. Our community needs and deserves these protections, and many people think that we already have them, and we simply don't. So that's something that we can do right now, which will be a really good one.
Amazing. Sunu, you want to hop in and talk to us about Bostock?
Sure. So I was at EEOC for 15 years, and slowly over decades of work by many civil rights attorneys and others, the law developed in such a way to say that the protections against sex discrimination that are in our federal laws also include protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Very slowly over time, that began to be developed. And it was not until last summer in Bostock where the Supreme Court took that analysis on. And so we can now make arguments that protections against sex discrimination also include protections for LGBTQ people broadly. So we have it in the workplace pretty clearly, but it's tied to Title VII, so we need 15 or more employees. And so there's still some limits. And so while we have that, and it's being interpreted in education, and the President Biden on the first day has said, each agency, you need to look at your laws and how this Bostock analysis applies. And that's wonderful. And that work must continue. But we cannot have our rights be based on, do we have a friendly administration? Is the court going to interpret something a certain kind of way? So while that work is critical and progressing, that's why we need the Equality Act, so that it's enshrined in federal law. And there's no question mark. It's not, oh, we can sort of make an argument about it. We'll have it. And so that's how sort of Bostock is great. The executive order is great, but we also, oh, sorry, it's BOSTOCK. And I can say a little more. I mean, there were actually 3 cases that went up to the Supreme Court together. And there was Zarda, Bostock, and also Amy Mann, who was a trans woman who was part of that trilogy. And those cases together are known as Bostock, the 3 of them together. So they do involve one trans worker and then 2 men who are gay that were in those cases. So really, really important development of the law. And, you know, Tal was asking about how the law has developed. Yesterday, I was able to sit in on a session that David Cole, who's the legal director at ACLU, gave with, I think it was students and lawyers in India. And they've had some developments in their case law. And it was like going to a Lavender Law conference like 10 years ago, because they were saying things like, we have limited resources, why should we use it on marriage equality, which is a patriarchal institution? You know, it was a really fascinating discussion. And it was interesting to have him sort of say there are a variety of opinions on this, but, you know, some people thought that if you can get people to see that this is about love and about families and relationships, and we can remake those institutions if when we are in them and nobody's forced to get married, like all of those arguments that sort of led to that. I thought that was a really interesting parallel to a lot of the discussions that have happened in the US, but it is interesting. And as Amani said, we have the right to marry, but if we can get literally rejected from housing in many and half our states, what good is that right? And we need to make sure that these rights are tied to the economic realities of our lives.
I'm struck also by the fact that if we have at-will employment in most states, they don't need to justify it based on being trans or to fire someone. You can just, you know, you mopped the floor wrong, so I'm firing you, and there's no protection on that basis. Continuing on with sort of this gap between legal protection and queerness being actually celebrated or a non-issue at work, whatever someone's personal preference is. How do we close that gap? What does winning look like? Eloise, I know for you in particular, the sense of the space being safe enough to come out is recent, and I'm curious to hear what it took broadly to bring that about.
It took a lot of allies, and it took a lot of people invested in my success. And I was the first trans woman to come out at the firm. So there was a lot of education that had to happen, and about pronouns and dead naming and the basics. And yet, Kearney is an old firm, and for many, we've struggled with diversity for many years, and we've struggled with a gender diversity, especially. I think only 9% of our partners are women. That's ever so slightly ticking up, not to take another 100 years to get there. And yet people like across everybody stepped up and really made my transition successful. And they have been invested in my success. And Tal, to your point a moment ago, in consulting, it's very easy to get rid of somebody. You just get not invited to a meeting, or, and this is true for any consultant, not just a queer one. It's very easy to just get disintermediated from the power structure and the client engagements, and without the, pretty much your whole pipeline dries up, and then you're out of there, and it becomes obvious to everybody, not just you. And I was convinced that was going to happen, and the opposite happened, and I got pulled in, and being out freed me up to be, and this sounds so cliche, so forgive me, but it allowed me to be my best self. And I come in with a I come in with a passion each. I'm so happy. And yeah, so I think that, and then the other piece that success looks like is walking into the boardroom. And I walk into a lot of boardrooms with executives and being visibly queer. And I remember going to a client in Amsterdam before the pandemic, and there was 19 guys and me, like 19 men. The Carney team was 4 men plus me, and then 15 men from the client. And some of the clients would not look me in the eyes, even though they loved what I was saying. We had a very vibrant discussion, and I was there. I spoke for probably, I took the time. I walked in that room and I probably spoke for almost 2.5 hours out of a 4-hour meeting. I spoke to them, and some of them were uncomfortable with me. And yet we still won the project. So that's what it means to be visible.
I love how I'm full disclosure, I'm working for Carney this summer. So also Carney is the kind of place where you get to publicly ask questions of your boss's 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 boss even before you're fully employed there. Imani and Suno, do you have some thoughts for me about what you've seen in your legal work or in your advocacy work about that gap between legal inclusion, legal protection and true workplace safety?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I was saying to our panelists, race discrimination has been illegal for how long? And I think that highlights the limits of the law. We're still in the midst of this racial reckoning that's long overdue. We're still dealing with the fallout from Me Too 3 years later, very live. And these matters have been quote unquote illegal for a long time. On the other hand, you need to have the baseline legal protection so you can at least try to have that hook as well when you go to your HR, or when you go to your union, or when you go to your friends who are going to back you in the workplace. The more rights you have under the law, the better. But that's just one tool. And, as Dr. Epstein said, you need that community organizing. You need those friends who are going to go in with you and say, no, this is the right thing to do. You need to have white allies who are speaking up about racism in the workplace. And whatever, people always ask me about the role of allies, and they say, well, I don't want to be the one. And it's like, no, we all need to be the ones. Right. And it doesn't mean you always need to be the one on the microphone, and it doesn't mean you always need to be the one on the panel, but you need to create opportunities. But if you hear about racism or sexism or homophobia, transphobia, any of these things happening in the spaces where you work, it's so crucial to raise it. And you can raise it publicly, you can raise it quietly to the side, you can do it one-on-one, but sort of taking that risk, and you may not have the exact right words. You might not even know what it is about that situation that feels off, but you know that that something was either a microaggression or just an implication. And you got to speak up about it, because we all have to be doing this for each other and with each other. And just having the law is the baseline. these sorts of day-to-day interactions at work, when we speak up and make things better, is what makes it alive.
And we do all have a place in that too. You know, so often when we talk about legal protections in this structural change, we act like these decisions are made exclusively in courtrooms. And that's not true. You know, across the history of our movement, there have been people in the streets, activists, there have been people that have not been in courtrooms. And what they've been in the streets for are the things that ultimately are decided in courtrooms. So whenever there is any sort of disconnect that we say that advocacy organizations and people that do advocacy are at odds with activists, that's not true. All of these things work together, and it's important. And it's important, you know, Sunu mentioned the 3 cases that made up the Bostock decision, but they were just regular things. The Donald Zarda case, Donald was a skydiving instructor, and he told a female client that he was gay when she said that she was uncomfortable with him strapping himself to her. And he was, you know, and this was just saying his sexual orientation. That's what he was suing about. You know, the second case was about, and I'm trying to think of his name right now. Oh, the Bostock case, Gerald Bostock. He was a great employee. He had favorable performance evaluations, and he started playing for a gay softball league. Like that's what happened. Like we're talking about Amy Stevens. She was near retirement. She was doing her job for years, and she just said, "Hey, when I'm coming to work on Monday, I'll be wearing a dress. This is my gender identity. These are my pronouns." She's been doing the job well for years, and she's near her retirement. She just wants to do her job. You know, these cases are not, I mean, think about what we're talking about here. You know, like this is not, we have to be able to be ourselves. And this isn't even like revolutionary what we're asking for right now, you know, like, and I think that that's a really important part of what made up these decisions. Like, this is just who we are, and that's something that's really important. So, you know, when we think about like what equality looks like and what it means for us to be able to be ourselves, and this is what we're talking about. This is what we're looking at.
I'm so struck by that. My next question actually is about what we ask for, and we're asking for so little already, but I'm a utopian when I'm like in my political home, and you should always ask for what you really want rather than, you know, the moderated version of what you want in the first pitch, right? And what should we ask for next? What do we leverage to do that? Sunu, do you want to lead us off here?
Sure, absolutely. And I think this is where you all are going to be such powerful actors, because, you know, these laws that we're trying to amend and make a little better, that's like the baseline. We also are working towards policy about sexual harassment and pay equity and funding for childcare. I mean, there's so many things that we need that are not even included right now in our current set of laws. And that's where I think corporate America can really be helpful. In the same way that lots of corporations had protections for LGBTQ people before they were even evolved to be part of our existing laws, corporate America can do so much when it comes to pay equity. I mean, we just had Equal Pay Day, and one of the links is about all of the pay discrimination, especially for women of color. And there can be lots of pay transparency. There can be not relying on salary history, because we know that is absolutely harmful. And I'll get to my poem, but like when you're doing hiring, you know, sort of not putting in actual qualifications that are not necessary for the job, that can really close doors that are unrelated to the skills needed for the job. You know, there's sort of childcare and family leave and how women are treated in the workplace. There's so many ways and contexts in which corporations can lead the way and not just do the baseline and not just say, okay, we complied with this, we have a policy against sex harassment, but no, what would you do if you actually wanted to make the workplace a safe place and a place where people of color can thrive, where people can thrive? What would that workplace look like? And I think that's what I'm excited about. What are corporations doing to push that forward? And so many are and can learn from each other. And so absolutely do not think of the legal requirements as the ceiling in any way.
Dr. Epstein, you're unmuted. I'm going to take that as a cue. You're ready to rumble on this.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I challenge leaders, corporate leaders, to do just that and lead on social justice, whether it's diversity in the workplace or sustainability or broader social issues. We cannot turn a blind eye. At a minimum, the customers expect it and demand it. And yet, and on the flip side is it's hard to operate in, especially globally, in a globalized world, where you are destroying native habitats or where you are taking advantage of disenfranchised people, or even worse, forced labor. And this happens way more than it should. And part of my work is bringing that to light and helping companies with strategies around that. And so I think it's, and especially in an era where governments and political NGO institutions are under attack, they are not leading the way anymore, and they are being dragged into this. And it's oftentimes companies that are leading the way. So I think that's important. I just want to add, though, to the list sooner to your list that you were describing. The former president and certain states still have the statute where medical providers can deny service to people based on religious exemption, which means that if I'm in a car crash, I can be turned away from I can die. I can die out, they can let me bleed out because they can claim religious exemption and not be, and have no repercussions. And those are, so I have to think very clearly, or I have to think long and hard about which states I'm going to in the United States. I'm a consultant, I travel every week. I have to really think about that. And that's not like going to Mexico or the Middle East or somewhere else. That's in America. And so these federal protections mean something for just the safety of just going to work. And I think they're all part of this bigger trend, trend of getting, coming to terms with this stuff. Sorry, that was two different thoughts.
Amazing. I mean, this is such a great panel. Y'all, like these ladies are brilliant. So thanks so much. I just wanted to add to, Sunu actually said a lot of what I was going to say, but one thing that I think is really important is thinking about who are in positions and how we get them there, creating a pipeline so that we're getting different perspectives too, because often when we want to be intersectional, as much as we want there to be, and honestly, I'm trying to build a checklist, how we can be intersectional, a path that we can go through. It's not easy to do. A lot of times, the ways that we are more inclusive is just having someone with a different perspective in a position of power to make a difference. It's so odd how easy that, how much that can just fundamentally shift the way an organization works. And so to do that, to make sure that we're reaching out for folks, that we are finding ways to make our teams more diverse, because that also makes our teams better. Like when we have, and there's so much research that shows that when our teams are diverse, that we excel in so many different ways. And that's something really important. Another thing I want to say is that it's important that we pay people when we're thinking about consultants, we're thinking about people that have an expertise. So often when we find someone who is, who has 2 PhDs, and we're going to talk to this person as an expert on something, this person that is running this large organization, and we pay these people without thinking about it. But then when we want someone with a very particular experience about a lived experience from someone who's been unstably housed, someone who is or has, we have to make sure that when that experience just as
hello,
that experience is just as important as having a conversation with someone with these 2 PhDs. We are talking about someone that has a perspective that we need and that someone else has. And so we need to pay those folks. And so when you think about that, I just try to pay people the same way. When we need an area of expertise that I don't have, then we pay people what we pay people for doing that. And I think that's another way to think about that. We should also think about the ways that we make decisions in our organizations, who's involved in those decisions, and the different ways we allow people to say it, to give their examples. I think probably everyone in this panel has had someone, you've said something and someone has taken credit for your idea. I am absolutely positive that everyone on this panel has had that experience before. And it's not the biggest deal in the world, but it's frustrating. What are other ways that make decisions that that people are given credit for their experiences and for thinking about things? That's something. And lastly, Sunu did talk so much about salary, and I think that's important. Something else to consider: when you're able to make decisions about what salary should be, you actually don't need people to negotiate a salary at all. You know what your budget is, you know what you can pay people. So just pay people that, because that is not, in my line of work, them being able to negotiate a salary doesn't make them better at their job. And we know that the people that are not good at that are typically the same people. They're typically people of color. They're typically LGBTQ people. They're typically women, trans, and non-binary folks. It hurts the same people all the time. Just graduating college, men are paid 7% more than women, and we don't even know what that looks like for trans people because we're not even looking at that data. Last thing, I wasn't planning to talk about this, but looking at data, because if we want to be intersectional, even our data doesn't allow us to be that way. When we're talking, Sunu talked about the difference in salary, and we know that women make about 20% less than men, and we know that women of color make far less than that. When we start looking at trans women, we know that we're talking about trans people, like 80% of trans people have experienced discrimination in the workplace, but we don't have those same numbers. So if you were someone who was writing a paper on this, you might leave that out just because it's not an easy thing to talk about. That people with disabilities make 37% less than people without disabilities. These are all intersectional ways that we need to think about the ways that we pay people, and that is our responsibility. That's not just data that we should just keep out there, because when we're looking at people, especially trans women of color that have disabilities that are underrepresented in all these ways, we don't actually have statistics, but all of these things are pointing to showing us that these folks are making far, far less than white men. And that's something that's our responsibility as well. And I'm done now.
I mean, I would love to add, just absolutely right. And we've actually have a point now where we don't forward postings around unless there's a salary listed in the posting. And so instead of, someone's like, oh, forward this around, we write them a note saying, are you going to post a salary band? Because if you're not, we're actually not going to send it around. And it actually has been this sort of peer pressure among progressive organizations, because we also need to practice that. We've been telling everyone else to do it. And so that has become a really important thing. Like when I hired a litigation fellow, we had the post there. And so there was no question. And we have to get into that habit, and it's really helpful. Absolutely. I mean, I think also, if you want, I can sort of pop in with this poem now because it is relevant to.
I would love that. And then we're going to segue to audience Q&A, because I'm sure there is robust questions.
So the reason I wanted to read this poem is because this week I'm getting these postings from the federal government jobs, which is exciting that people want to work there again. And I saw something, it was for a lawyer job, and it said something like, you need to come from a highly ranked law school. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means like the top 1, 2. I don't know if it means like this list, that list. I just don't know what it means. What I do know is that it's discouraging, and it's a sure way to turn away really qualified candidates. And so, I did some posting around that. It probably wasn't because of that, but then I saw some other postings and it said, you need to have a law degree from an accredited law school. And I was like, that makes sense. So this is a poem from a long time ago that's titled, "The Successful Candidate Should Hail from a Well-Regarded Law School." Job posting, March 2013. There are 2 schools of thought. You should go where you feel the most comfortable, or you should go to a school that will open the most doors. 1992, handwritten letter from Professor Patricia Williams in reply to mine. In the weeks before the LSAT in 1993, I walked across the college lawn, my only witness, the scent of freshly cut grass. The library opened at 8, and for 1 month, every morning in the 2 hours before class, I studied for this test that was the key to my future. Classmates complained to my face, "You know you'll get into law school because you're a person of color." No relatives in this field, I knew nothing of prep classes, no academic counselor informed me of practice exams or asked me to review my essay. I used one study book purchased at a bookstore over the summer. Every morning before classes, I sat in the library overlooking the snow-covered trees, trying my hand at impossible logic games and math, these building blocks of arguments, improving my time slowly. Then one morning, the minivan to transport us 2 hours away to the closest test in Bloomington, Indiana was late. Our tickets read in bold, "No one will be admitted after 8:30 a.m. At 8:30, we sat completely still at a red light at the outskirts of Bloomington. Upon arrival, the registration desk was empty, and on the 3rd floor of the campus building, we ran into a kind proctor who had dipped into the hallway searching for his missing 5 before beginning his exam. The 5 of us, breathless, entered the room, filled in our name in circles, and began. And when I looked up, still breathless, after entering my name, I still remember that proctor smiled. In 1996, California voters passed Prop 209, a ban on affirmative action. My score reflected the less than ideal circumstances of my testing. I forgot to complete the easy puzzles first and go back to the difficult. It was the last test of the season. I ended up where I belonged, a public interest focused law school, one my mother cannot find at the top of many school ranking charts, no matter how hard she looks or how many times she asks me. When I visited Harvard Law School and sat on the bench outside the classroom, another student inquired, "So when's your essay due to your law school advisor?" But I knew of no such person. The only person who read my essay was my father. As for me, my reliance on grace began to be well practiced. And on some days, I am still waiting at that 8:30 red light, my chances at well-regarded simply dissipating before my eyes. So I read that poem and like my classmates are like, "What are you talking about? Northeastern is a well-regarded school." And I'm like, yes, that was not my point. My point is that that kind of language is gonna close doors for the applicants and students that you want at your businesses, at your corporations, who are outstanding and excellent candidates. I mean, my friend teaches at CUNY Law School. It's a more affordable, it's a really radical, extremely wonderful law school. But again, if you're only going to look at quote unquote highly regarded, quote unquote well regarded, I don't know what that means. And you need to keep the doors open for excellent, excellent candidates. Thank you.
Or wait, this, we got to do the snaps. Thank you so much, Sunu. That was beautiful. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. We've very graciously been extended, had our time extended just a little bit. If you have a question, you can raise your hand, I'm watching, or you can drop something in the chat, whichever you prefer. And if not, I do have 1 more question in my pocket. I'm gonna hold for 10 more seconds and then ask my question, if that's okay. Should have had the Jeopardy theme song queued up here. Okay, it doesn't seem like the audience is overflowing right now. But finally, I think for me, thinking about opening doors for the people coming behind me, what's been on my mind lately is Dr. Timnit Gebru. For folks who aren't familiar, she's a beloved, well-regarded, prominent, and wildly accomplished queer woman of color who works in ethical AI at Google. And Google, she wanted to publish some research that was underlining that Google's approach to racial equity in AI stuff was fakakta. And it was so threatening to Google that they pushed her out in a really disastrous PR move, rather than accepting the threat that her research represented and the and the whatever they didn't want to change, whatever was in that paper they didn't want to publish, so much that they pushed out this beloved, very prominent person. As young professionals picking our battles in a cultural moment where equity efforts are in the spotlight, how should we set our own bright white lines on behalf of those coming after us? Timnit left the company because of this moment, and yeah, I'm curious as to your recommendations for us. Dr. Epstein, would you start us off?
Sure. I think it gets back to what it's allyship, and it goes many directions. At Kearney, we have enterprise resource groups, ERGs, and we have Black at Kearney. We have Proud, which is the queer group. We have the Women's Network, and probably a dozen of them. And you find that that when it's Black History Month, it's the and there's social justice moments to be had. It's the Women's Network and the Proud Network that show up for the Black at Kearney Network. And when it's Pride Month, or there's the Equality Act, or these elements are happening, they, the Black at Kearney folks are right there with us. And I think, and it gets to my point earlier about allyship, everybody, like, we're in this together. We're fighting this structural paradigm together. And so I think there's this general allyship. And then I think, Tal, you referenced this, reaching back and helping the next generation up. And I can't emphasize that is a huge priority for me, and it makes all the difference in the world. Because once you step through the door, the first thing, or once you climb through the hatch, the first thing is you got to reach the hand back down and grab as many people up, because that's the only way we make a difference. And I try to I do the philosophy of I'd rather have 4 quarters than 100 pennies, and I put 4 quarters worth of effort into, or I pick a handful of people to help them up, so that I make sure that my contribution to them really helps them, and not just check the box activity that, oh, I met with them once a year. I want to make a difference in 4 people or 8 people, or however many I can do, but I'm going to make a difference. And I think both the kind of looking laterally and pulling people up.
I love that line. It's 4 quarters instead of 100 pennies.
Yeah, I didn't make that up. So but I love that saying.
I mean, on the point of allyship, I'll say that, after this Asian women were killed in Atlanta, the Black Men's Caucus at our church, our Unitarian church, sent a beautiful note to the Asian American group at our church. And it was about solidarity and understanding violence. And like, I'm tearing up just thinking about it, because it was so moving. And I think Dr. Epstein is absolutely right. Often it's sort of groups who do feel marginalized in one way or another who are here for each other, and that's so powerful. Well, and in terms of sort of mentoring, I think absolutely, partly that's through just, even now someone will say, like, I never saw another South Asian queer person. And so I'll get these emails. And so I'm reminded about why it is important, as Amani said, to be openly. It's not just being out, but just like openly queer and naming that, especially in settings where that may feel a little bit risky. Because, we know retaliation is real, to your question, and there are risks. And I think we sort of have to deal on a day-to-day basis of what risks do we want to take. And many of us, we may have part of our identity that's marginalized, but we also have, many of us have incredible privilege. It's like, I read that poem, but like, both my parents had graduate degrees. It just wasn't in law, right? Like, there is so much economic diversity within the Asian American community. And I consider myself very privileged to come from a middle-class background. And so recognizing that, I do feel like it's my responsibility to take risks and to be really out there on a number of issues, whether or not they impact me personally. And so, for example, like disability justice is always something I'm naming and bringing to the forefront. We're constantly getting these documents that say like, as Americans, da da da, and I'm like, actually these laws protect folks even if they're not Americans, regardless of national origin. And you know, you may not think that's a queer issue, but I know that's a queer issue. So I hope that you're all fighting for immigration justice too. And I can go on, but you can see that my lens about social justice is that we all have a responsibility. And you know, my partner works in sustainability, so Dr. Epstein, represent or mentioned the green movement. I think all of these are areas that we need to be doing our work. Thank you.
I know we're very close to time, so I just want to say I completely agree with everything that's been said. We hear a lot the importance of, being the first but not the last, and making sure that we're just making it possible to bring people with us. To recognize that, I think I said this earlier, that our reputations a lot of times as queer people, as people of color, queer and trans people, and people of color and people from underrepresented identities, that our reputations aren't as flexible as our counterparts. And so there are ways that that's difficult. And so you have to think about, okay, which, the battles that you're going to fight, but then also having folks that might be willing to do that as well. There are, and Suna made a great point, there are a lot of ways at this point in my life that I have privilege, and I'm happy to use that. There was a time that I didn't have that at all, and so I'm always happy to use that. There are ways that it's easier for me to bring up some things in some rooms, because in some rooms it also remains being something that's really difficult, and so figuring that out. And then lastly, looking for mentorship, like I am very grateful, and I'm where I'm at because there are people that make time for me, that make space for me, and so I'm always willing to do that. And then the other thing too is finding ways to connect to people. I have a mentor myself that's older, but I also have mentors that are younger, and not mentees. They are mentors that are younger. I read something about having mentees anytime you're over, I forget, 33 maybe, that you need a younger mentor. There are ways that I have access to people because of my age, because of my experience. And similarly, when I was younger, there are ways that I understood how the world worked that I know that other people didn't, because I had access to things then as well. And so just making sure to remember that relationships are reciprocal. So often we look to people and say, oh, you have this fancy job, you've been doing these things, can you teach me? The thing is, like, there are ways. Exactly, TikTok is a great one. My wife works in advertising. It is so important for her to stay up on the things that are cool. And so she's a little cool with TikTok, and I am medium, but anyway, to make sure that relationships are reciprocal, to make sure that you are, that you have something to give as a young person, and we have something to give as we get older in our careers as well.
This is incredible. I want to keep going for hours, but in the spirit of queer women always giving more than what is asked, we're 10 minutes over, and I'm very grateful for all of your contributions here. The resource doc is there for folks who want to continue reading. Thank you so much. This was a dream come true for me. And I'm going to pass it back over to Jordan to do our closing session, or our closing announcement, I think. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, panelists. That was a really wonderful session. I learned so much. I felt so much. It was just great all around. I saw a quick question in the chat. We will be releasing these recordings on our YouTube channel and on our website. Might take a little time for us to edit them and make them all nice and pretty, but they will be released, and an announcement will go out in case you want to share with folks. I wanted to just bring on one of our corporate partners to say a few closing remarks. Arai Buendia is the global manager of GLAM at McKinsey & Company. Arai, would you like to say some words?
Absolutely. I hope you can all hear me. And if you can't, please wave or shout or do something. But hello, my name is Arai Buendia. Thank you, Jordan, for the lovely introduction. My pronouns are she, hers. I live in Chicago, and as Jordan mentioned, I am the global manager of GLAM. That is the LGBTQ+ network, the organization at McKinsey. Essentially, I like to joke that my role means that I get to deal with all the rainbows and all the beautiful aspects of inclusivity all day, every day, which makes me very happy. Sometimes it makes me want to pull out my hair because there's so much work to be done and so much ways that we can push the world, but that is fundamentally my job. It's great privilege and great, I kind of attack it with great excitement. In general, when I was asked to speak, I'm not gonna lie, I was a little daunted. There's so many wonderful panelists that have been coming up through this entire conference. And so wanted to make sure that any closing remarks I gave were something that might be helpful, right? And I also recognize I'm the one person who's probably standing between you and happy hour the rest of your weekend. So wanted it to be something that could hopefully be meaningful. So in the end, I decided on potentially giving 2 pieces of advice that I found particularly relevant for me, and I'm hoping that maybe they will resonate with you as well. So my first piece of advice is find and cultivate relationships with people who affirm you, which in the end, I think often allows you to bring your authentic self to work, and hopefully, well, work into your entire lives, to be perfectly honest, which will hopefully in the end make you more happy and successful. I can personally trace my own path through McKinsey pretty much in a dot by dot sort of fashion because of the people who supported me and emboldened me to try new things, because they were able to affirm exactly the person that I am. And so in addition to finding those people for yourself, I also advise and encourage you to try to be that person for other people. For me, when I think about bringing my authentic self and being affirmed, it was less about being out at McKinsey. I very wonderfully found that I could be as out as I wanted as soon as I joined the company. But for me, it was more about letting go of the perceptions that I had coming in as a consultant and what a consultant needed to be, and really supporting and embracing my own strengths. And therefore being able to say, like, this is who I am, and this is the strengths and benefits I can bring to a team, and finding a way to have my voice be heard continuously. And I found that I was most successful when I was able to find those people who supported me along the way with that. And that enabled me to connect the dots to lead into my role as it is now, which again, gets me to be put in a position where I can then continue to help other people find their own voices, find that, and push McKinsey as a firm to even be more inclusive for all colleagues. My second piece of advice is to take your PTO. It is something that I find very important, and I want everyone to keep doing it. It makes me so sad when I hear like general statistics about how Europeans take their PTO all the time, and they're always, not always on vacation, but Europeans frequently take their vacation, and yet in America, we often don't take our vacation, and there's so much burnout, so forth. So I just want to remind everyone to take care of yourself, especially right now with all of the way that the world is right now. Your PTO and just having moments of self-care is so important. So please do take it. With that, I hope that these are helpful reminders and tips for you. Thank you so much all for having me here, joining this. It's been a wonderful full day, and all the events and panels have been so phenomenal. So thank you to Jordan and the Out Women in Business crew. So have a wonderful weekend. Jordan, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thank you so much. We'll definitely all be reevaluating how much PTO we take after that advice. So thank you for that. I'd now like to call up one of our board members from reaching out, Paula Cobb, for just some final remarks.
Hi, I'm Paula Cobb, and we couldn't let Akia be the last one between you and cocktail hour. So I am going to take that blame. I'm Paula Cobb. As Jordan mentioned, I'm honored to be on the board of Reaching Out. I'm also Chief Business Officer at a gene therapy startup, and I'm on the board of a public biotech company. Wanted to just, at the end of this amazing day, say thank you again to all of our speakers. You've been amazing. I've been inspired many times over on little things and big things alike. Also, our sponsors, thank you so much. None of this happens without your support of the organization and specifically of this event. And organizers who put the thought into designing the panels and working with the panelists to get ready, thinking of all the questions, leading us in all these chats. Thank you. And then to all of you who are still tuned in from so many places across the United States and the world, thanks for being here. There's a lot of Zoom fatigue, but someone mentioned in one of these sessions that I was in that this has not been a Zoom fatigue kind of Zoom. This has actually been a really enlivening and fun one. So I hope that you've all gotten that also out of today. We very much hope to be back together in person next year, safely, all fully vaccinated and past the worst of this pandemic. Thank you for being a part of the Out Women in Business community and the broader Reaching Out community. The best way to have more women be out in the business world is for us to connect like this in forums like this, but also throughout the year after days like this to reach out to each other when we need help and also when we see that there is an opportunity to help others. So please keep the spirit of this alive with you throughout the year. If you are enthusiastic about Out Women in Business, we encourage you also to make donations to Reaching Out and to the Out Women in Business part of Reaching Out to help to support the event and to help us to grow it and make it even more robust and bring it to more people. And then finally, would like to invite you to join us at the happy hour. So if you missed the one last night, or if you're up for a second one, please, it's so back onto the Pathable webpage, and hope to see you all there. Thank you so much.